So today we're going to be talking about why nature is good for the economy and for nature in itself, contrary to what some might believe. We're going to talk about the bucket effect and how that affects the deer overpopulation. We are going to talk about who really pays for conservation. We are going to talk about African safari trophy hunts, and we are going to talk about the conditions that farm-raised animals that everybody eats from the grocery store, the conditions that they go through in their life. So, to begin, deer overpopulation. So we're going to start off with something called the bucket effect. As you can see on the right here, we got an overfilled bucket. Water keeps pouring in, and it just keeps over pouring out. Think of this as the deer population. Our ecosystem can only hold so many deer. When there's nothing to stop that deer population from exponentially rising, it just overfills, and the ecosystem suffers. The only way to combat this is to therefore poke a hole in the bucket. This hole in the bucket is the hunters in our ecosystem. Hunters basically use regulated hunting seasons in order to keep that bucket from overfilling. So my next point would be that hunters are the biggest support financially for conservation. And I put this little graph up just to kind of back myself up here. And as you can see, money for wildlife and conservation, 75% is supported by sportsmen. There are more hunters. There's triple the amount of hunters from 1955 to today. And there is, what does it say? Probably about, just look at the graph about what the wildlife numbers are looking at from the 1890s when we had the fur trade, unregulated, by the way, fur trade, you had no regulations on hunting, populations were nearly extinct back in the 1890s. Fast forward to today, when all the regulations were put in place to protect these populations, and look how much they've skyrocketed. So basically, what this means is that when a hunter buys equipment, so such as like their hunting equipment, like their clothes, whatever, ammo, their firearms licenses, their hunting licenses, their trout stamps, their fishing licenses, their hunting education courses, all, let me rephrase myself, not all, but most of that money goes towards wildlife conservation. Therefore, the amount of money we spend in order to hunt and get ready to hunt and fish and all that goes towards preserving the ecosystem, so preserving the land that they live on and the populations themselves. So just to like kind of butt off of that, I wanted to talk about money in Africa. So I know last class that we had, I took some questions from you guys, and when we did that whole little speed dating thing, you guys asked about like, oh, well, trophy hunting, you're not doing anything with the heads, you're not doing anything with the meat, you're just keeping it for the head or whatever. So a lot of that happens in Africa. There was that whole debate with the person who shot the lion, and there's people who like get the elephants. So be it. But those people that go on these African safari hunts and hunt these trophy animals spend astronomical amounts of money. And basically, so I put this up to show, so basically African safari hunts contribute to $326 million and supports over 53,000 jobs in Africa. 1.4 million square kilometers of land is conserved for hunting in Africa, which is more than twice the size of Texas. Hunting is the driver for conservation in many rural areas where photo safari operations or agriculture do not offer economic opportunity. And hunting changes attitudes of local communities and gives wildlife a positive value, providing incentives against poaching and mitigating human-wildlife conflict. So, in other words as well, hunting in Africa, so when you go hunting in Africa, right, when you hunt these trophy animals, you can't take the meat back. The only thing you can take back is the trophy itself. Therefore, all that money you're spending on it goes to the tribes people, goes to the African people, and all the meat goes to the local tribes where you are hunting. That local tribe that you hunted off of gets all the meat from that animal, so it feeds their entire village, which is a great point. So another point I would like to make is the conditions that farm-raised animals live in to feed the American people and people all around the world. But nobody bats an eye because they don't see this every day. But they want to come after hunters for going out into the woods and hunting one of these animals under regulations and respectively hunting one animal to feed their family. But if you look at the conditions of, say, chickens, you got X amount of chickens in this one place where they can barely step 5 feet away from where they stand. Same with the turkeys. It's all food that Americans eat, but never bat an eye at. So I just think that it's a little unfair for people to judge hunters for hunting for their own food when they sit there and eat stuff that's farm raised and treated a lot worse than free roaming wildlife that we hunt. So another point I would like to make is I'm sorry about this, but I want to bring it back to overpopulation. And going past the bucket effect a little bit, right? So I want to give some examples of why that bucket overflowing is such a bad thing. And I'll start by saying that, okay, good, so the population is booming, good, okay? But when that population starts growing to the point where that ecosystem cannot handle it, those deer need to eat. So they start grazing on all the food on the woods floor and everything, and they'll eat it raw. They'll just literally eat it bare. And why that's such an issue is just starting with the deer population, that leaves no food for the rest of the deer. Therefore, they all start to starve. And when they are starving, they are more prone to diseases. So not only are they going to be dying from starvation, they'll also be dying from diseases that they're getting from starving. So we'll take it even a step further and go past the deer population. When the deer population is so high and they've overgrazed, all they leave left are the little ferns that start to grow up because there's no vegetation around them. Therefore, when those ferns grow, it cuts off all the sunlight into those woods and casting so many shadows that it doesn't allow any more vegetation to grow, which not only makes it harder for the deer to find food later on, it makes it harder for any other animal to find food, plus any birds or any mice, chipmunks, squirrels, whatever, anything that nests on the ground, they have nothing to nest in anymore. So they're more prone to predators. Therefore, it affects every population, not just the deer. So I just wanted to touch onto that because that's a very important role in that. Also, have you ever been scared of hitting a deer while driving? Because I know I have. I've almost hit a couple of them. And a lot of that comes from overpopulation. And since they're so overpopulated, they can't just roam the woods that they're in. They start roaming into suburban and cities to find food, therefore creating more dangers to human life from car accidents, anything like that. But overall today, I would just like to go over a couple of little points and recap what I talked about. So we got the bucket effect, explaining how overpopulation is bad and how hunters can control that population from overflowing. Then we have how hunters spend most of the money to fund conservation efforts. We talked about African safari hunts and how those trophy hunts actually benefit the African people and the African wildlife more than you'd think. We talked about farm-raised animals and the conditions they live in, and how free-roaming wildlife are far better off, even when being hunted, than any of these farm-raised animals. Thank you for your time. Any guys that have any questions?